Hello everyone, welcome back to Make a Website lessons on Codecademy. So in the last lesson we were still looking at CSS, but we mainly looked at class selectors. Today we're going to be looking at more CSS, and we're going to be looking at something that's similar to classes, which are IDs, and we're also going to see how we can add a background image. At the end we're just going to recap what we have covered about CSS so far. In CSS, the background image property sets a background image of your choice for a given selector as seen below. So for example, if your selector was .hero, so the class hero, you could set its background image to be to a certain URL, for example. The CSS rule above assigns the image hosted at that place to elements that have a class attribute set to hero. So you can have multiple class attributes to multiple divs, and not all divs have to have a class attribute. Some can not have anything. But to any div attribute or any class attribute that does have the class hero, if this is your image, then they're all going to have the background image of whatever that is. So two elements that have a class attribute set the hero get that. To control the size of the chosen background image, use the property background size as seen below. As you can see there. Here we have specified that we want the image to completely cover elements with the .hero class. So if you did cover, then for example, if you were targeting the hero class with that image, the whole section that has the division of hero is going to get that image. So instructions, let's add a background image to the Mistwood Publishing homepage. In main.css, locate the hero class selector. Inside the rule, insert the background image. Here is a URL for a great photo to use. So hero, we want to use background image, and that's our selector. Let's put the semicolon there before I forget. URL in parentheses, and we are using this image. There we go. Remember, in order for the background image to work, you will need to include URL and parentheses in the properties value, like I did. And the image URL must be contained within quotation marks. Okay, so let's not forget that. They've given us double quotation marks, so I'm going to put double quotation marks as well. Click run and notice the background image assigned to the hero class div in the web browser. So what does our hero class div contain? It contains Sprout, it contains this paragraph, and it contains this link. So behind them we should get an image. Run, and as you can see, we definitely did get an image behind them. And just behind those elements. We didn't get the image across our whole web page. Okay. In the web browser, you may notice that the image seems rather close up. We can make it so that more of the image is seen by using the background size property. In main.css, in the hero selector below the background image property, add background size cover. So we covered that. We covered what that does before. So I'm just going to do it. Cover. There we go. Click run and notice the change in the web browser. Much more of the original photo is viewable within the hero class attribute. There we go. I need to scroll down more now. Finally, now that the background image covers the .hero div, the black font color makes it difficult to read the text of the H2 and P, because the background has a dark color as well. In main.css, give the .hero selector a color property of FFFFF, which is the hex code for white. So we want this. Run. Or maybe not. I think we need to change the font color to this. And pound symbol and semicolon. That's not the correct selector. Okay, that's weird. Okay, I was looking at the incorrect place. So I was looking at the hero A instead of just hero. So in here, what you need to do is just do color, colon, let's put the semicolon in right now before I forget, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and now once I do that, Sprout, a book by J. Daniel Bedford, and Read Now should all turn white. Or maybe this won't turn, oh yes, this won't turn white because if you have something more specific giving it an attribute, or I mean, yeah, a value, then that is going to be applied to it. So if you have anything more specific, applies it to the more specific thing, which is why this is green, as we have specified here. Let's move on. The background image makes a big difference. Nice work. So I think that you can agree that this looks much better than when it did without the image. A previous exercise introduced CSS class selectors to style HTML elements of specific classes. What if a web page design calls for an individual page element to be styled uniquely, but all other elements of that kind to be styled a different way? For example, to style one anchor element differently than all the others on a web page, you could use the HTML ID attribute. So you could give the anchor element an ID of learn code, and then all of the normal things such as href to link to there. But ID can then be used in CSS. Then in the CSS file you would create a rule for the ID selector using the pound symbol. So for the classes you use the dot, for IDs you use a pound symbol. So in this case, if you are trying to target this anchor element, then you do pound learn code and curly braces, and then change the color, for example, to whatever you want. About using ID. An ID attribute can only be used once because the ID is unique to the element it is assigned to. IDs have greater specificity than classes. So if an HTML element is using both ID and class attributes, the CSS rule for the ID will take precedence over that of the class. So if you gave it an ID of learn code and a class of, I don't know, code, then whatever you put in the CSS for the ID of learn code is going to be, so for example, if you put in the ID in CSS for the ID of learn code to be color red, and in the class code to be color white, then it's going to be red because ID is of a higher specificity. Below we will use an ID selector style to style a single HTML element differently than others of that kind on the web page. Instructions. In the exercise titled 6 font size, we enlarge the font size property for paragraph elements. This unintentionally increased the size of the paragraph, which reads that, which is at the very bottom. There we go. But we don't really want this to be so massive. We want it to be like a small copyright thing that you would see at the end of a website or web page. In index.html, locate the paragraph element mentioned above. Set its ID to footer. So this here, ID, not IF, ID equals footer. There we go. Run to continue. So now we have targeted this in a way, and now we can work on the ID of footer. In main CSS, add a new ID selector. Use pound footer as the name of the ID selector. I'll put that at the very end, seeing as it's a new thing. Footer, and there we go. Good. Give footer a font size property of 0.75 rem. So that's going to be to make it smaller. So font size colon 0.75 rem semicolon. Click run to see what changed in the browser. The footer paragraph is now size 0.75 rem. Let's run it. And as you can see, that looks much better than having that with massive text, because it's just where the copyright comes from. You don't really want that to be massive. It doesn't matter. It's not really that big of a big part of the web page. So let's recap what they have learned in this section of making a website. Congratulations, you worked hard and made it to the end of a challenging lesson. There were a lot of new concepts, so let's take a moment to review what you've learned. Web concepts. CSS, language used to style websites. Colors, fonts, and page layouts for a site are managed using CSS. And we learned that external CSS is usually more common than inline CSS. CSS selectors specifies exactly which HTML elements to style. Class selectors used to target classes of HTML elements, and ID selectors used to style an HTML element which has an ID attribute. External style sheets, here we go, CSS file that styles an HTML file externally via the HTML link element. CSS properties, font family sets font for a CSS selector, color sets font color for the CSS selector, font size sets font size for the text, and background image sets a background image of your choosing for a given selector. So if you don't know what any of these do and you want to find out, please make sure to watch my other videos, and then if you don't understand any of that, then do ask in the comments down below if you have any questions. In the specific video is usually much more helpful than if you ask it in the current video, but you can ask in this video about previous videos as well if you think that's more appropriate. But until the next time guys, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share and subscribe. If you didn't like it, dislike it and tell me how I can improve for next time. But yeah, until that next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.